Iteration statements allow you to loop through collections, such as a collection of file names, allowing you to process each one. In this lesson, you'll learn the basics of the iteration statements for each, for, while, and do while. So let's say we have a list of a collection of files here in an array, a string array, and they're called files. So let's define this string array. Let's have one called report PDF, and one called test PDF, and one called setup exe, and one called install exe. So notice that you can define your arrays on multiple lines. I usually do this if I have more than 3 or so they don't extend off to the right here. So let's iterate through these. Iterate just means to go through them, move through each item in a collection. With the for each statement, for each tab, and the variable name is file, and the collection is files. Note here that the implicit type var is used. If you were using C# 2.0, you would have to explicitly state what kind of variable file is. But ever since C# 3.0, you can simply define it as var and not worry about it. And you just let Visual Studio and the compiler infer from the context what type of variable that is. I generally use it just because it keeps code cleaner, easier to read and write. But don't confuse this with a variable type, which you have in some other languages. File is still a string to Visual Studio and to the compiler. In other languages, when you use var, you could change the variable file to an integer and the compiler wouldn't complain. In short, var is your friend, use it. So let's just display each file here to see if this works so far. And yes, it does. We see all 4 files. So my general rule is to use for each if you can, because it's simply easy. There's another way to iterate through this particular array of file names, and that is with for. So you type for, tab, and you get the full structure. I is the index of the array. So I do tab, and we want to go up to the length of the files array. The length of the files array is going to be 4 because there are 4 items. So I will start at 0 and then go to 1 and then go to 2 and then go to 3. 3 is less than 4, but 4 is not less than 4, so it'll exit out of the iteration loop at 3. So inside this, I is going to be 0, 1, 2, and 3. Since we don't have a nice variable being defined for us, as in the for each loop, what we have to do is define it ourselves. So string file equals files, and then pass in the index in the brackets, and you have it. So we can now display it like this, and we see that it displays them in the same way. Note also that this can be the implicit variable type, and it'll still work. The reason being that files is obviously an array of strings, so file has to be a string. That's how the compiler and Visual Studio figure it out. So let me show you a reason why you would want to use for instead of for each. Just one reason here. It would be something like this. If you wanted to display, instead of just the name here, you wanted to say this file is, and then the name, and the next file is, and the name. So let me go ahead and type that out here. This file is this one, and the next file is this one. And then you would have variables like current file and next file. So let's define these 2 variables. A current file would be this one, current file, and next file would be, I'm going to use the ternary operator here. Next file equals, evaluate I, the index, is less than length minus 1, which is 3. If it's less than that, then return the next file in the array. Otherwise, if we're at the last one, which is what this means, if we're at the last one, then there is not a next one. So we want to display this is the last one, for instance. And if we run this, we see that it says this file is report PDF and the next file is test PDF, right? This file is test PDF and the next file is setup exe, right? This file is setup exe and the next file is install exe. And install exe says this file is install exe and the next file is this is the last one. The point being here that you really couldn't do that inside the for each loop because you don't have the index. It's all taken care of for you. You could, of course, make a count index here and then increment it, but that's already being done within the structure of the for loop anyway. So you want to identify your programming task and then choose between the for each and for appropriately. So my rule is now use for each if you can and use for if you must. Now let me show you the other two iteration statements, while and do while, which is pretty much a matter of style. If you want to program like this, you can. There are reasons to use these, but I usually get by with for each and for. But let me show you how to do first the while iterator. So we have to define our index. So int I equals 0. Now notice here that I'm getting an error by defining I, and it says a local variable named I cannot be declared in this scope because it would give a different meaning to I, which is already used in a child scope to denote something else. And they're talking about this I right here. So what you need to do is simply put this whole block in brackets, which gives it another scope, and put this block in its own scope, and then you're able to run it. Note, this may not be the best programming practice, but it's very useful for demonstrations when you need to show the same code a number of times and don't want to keep changing the name of the variable. So let's do the while iteration statement. After we have defined I, we say while I is less than file's length, which you see repeated here, then do this, showing with while this file, and we have to do it the same way as in the for loop, send the index to the array and get that out. And in the while loop, we have to do our own incrementing here inside the body, just like we did it here. So it's basically the same as the for, it's just a different syntax here. You see this is here, this is here, and this is here. If we run it, we see that it does the same thing. So as I said, it's pretty much a matter of style, two ways to do the same thing. Another way to do the same thing is called do while. So let's put our scope curly brackets here, int I equals 0, same thing, and then do this block while this is true. So this is here, and this is here. And we can just copy all of this because it's the same. And showing with do while. And it does it the same way. So those are the basics on iteration statements. Let me repeat my rule of thumb. Use for each when you can. Use for when you must. And while and do if that happens to be your style.